All right, so welcome back. So this is going to be part 4 in our histology lecture. And in this part, we're going to be looking at bone as a connective tissue, so osseous connective tissue. We'll look at blood as a connective tissue, and then we'll look at some example pictures of connective tissues. So bone, or osseous connective tissue, this is going to be our hardest connective tissue, and this is going to be our hardest tissue in the body, all right? And so bones are usually a very superficial structure, right? So we can feel the bones through our skin, we can touch them, we can push on them. Oftentimes we can see bony projections, right? So these are very strong, right? We have certain bones that are stronger than others, right? With the strongest being our femur and our thigh. But they're generally inflexible, right? And so we'll talk about what makes bones strong and hard and resistant to compression. We'll also talk about what makes them somewhat flexible as well. When you look at the histology of bone, when you look at the histology of osseous tissue, you see these circular regions within the bone. So if you took a section of bone and you looked at it histologically, you'd see these large circular regions. And these large circular regions are called osteons, okay? Osteons. So this large circular region that you see here, this large circular region, hopefully you can see my cursor, this whole thing is an osteon. And that is the functional and structural unit of what's called compact bone. When we do our skeletal system lecture, we'll talk about another type of bone, and we'll talk about it a little bit here called spongy bone or trabecular bone. But this osteon is the functional structural unit of our bone. All of the smaller black dots that you see, those are the osteocytes. So these are our bone cells that we have surrounding and making up part of our osteon. And these are embedded within a hard, calcified extracellular matrix. Okay, so the extracellular matrix in this connective tissue of bone is not very loose. It's not super flexible like you see with cartilage and other dense connective tissue and loose connective tissue, but it's very hard. It's very firm. Okay, so this is what gives, in part, gives our bone its hardness, right? It's resistant to compression. So we also have circular rings that make up this large circular region that makes up this osteon. So if we look here, we see a large osteon. And then within this, making this up, we see smaller concentric rings. And these are called lamellae. So almost like if you took a section of a tree trunk or a tree branch, the whole branch itself would be the osteon. And then the rings that make up that branch would be the lamellae in this case. Okay. So when we look at our bone, we have these main structures. We have the osteon, which we said was the functional unit. Making up the osteon, we have the osteocytes, okay? And the osteocytes are embedded within a lacunae, or lacuna if you're talking about a singular, just like we had with our cartilage in the last part. We have lamellae, which are those concentric rings. And then we said we have the lacunae that houses the osteocyte, all right? As we do more lectures and we get into the skeletal system, we'll take a closer look at the osteon and the microscopic structure of bone, all right? Okay, now our last connective tissue here is blood. So blood is an example of a liquid connective tissue. So this is a connective tissue that's really unlike all the other ones because it's not hard, it's not firm, it's not dense, it's not like cartilage, it's not like bone, it's not like dense connective tissue or loose. It's kind of in its own class of being liquid. All right, so we have the same general things. We have proteins, we have an extracellular matrix, and we also have cells, right? So the cells are the main key thing that we look at here. And when you do blood in later lectures in AP2, you'll see and you'll look at the specifics of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So in general, we have plasma. Plasma is the extracellular matrix with the ground substance and with the proteins and whatnot. We have then 3 types of cells. We have red blood cells, which are called erythrocytes. The term erythro means red. We have white blood cells, which are called leukocytes. The term leuko means white. And then we have platelets, all right, which are called thrombocytes. Thrombo means to clot. So these are our cells that are involved with clotting, okay? So if you look here, you can see large red blood cells, which are red in color. You see white blood cells, and then not really pictured here, you may see some little fragments, these very small kind of purple dots these are the platelets or the thrombocytes. Okay, so we know that blood is responsible for transporting things. So we can transport gases and we can transport different molecules and ions in our blood. We can also have our white blood cells be involved with our immune response, and then we have thrombocytes or platelets that are involved with our ability to form a clot in a process called platelet plug formation, and this whole kind of overarching process called hemostasis, which is the stopping of blood or the stopping of bleeding, right? And so you'll talk about that more in AP2. Okay, so we transport things, transport waste, we transport oxygen, we have immune functions and immune properties, and then we have the stoppage of blood. So if you look at these images down here, you see the red cells, these small ones here, these are the red blood cells or the erythrocytes. These kind of blue-purple ones, these are the leukocytes or the white blood cells. And then the small kind of purple specks that you see, these are cellular fragments, and these are the platelets. So you'll learn in later lectures and in future classes how you make platelets, and you make them from a different cell called a megakaryocyte. And a megakaryocyte gets very large and it fills with cytoplasm and ultimately bursts into these small cytoplasmic fragments, which we call platelets. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of connective tissue, and then we'll stop this lecture and we'll move on to talking about muscle. All right, so take a look at this, pause the video, try to identify it. You can look back at notes and look at other resources, and I will explain the answer and we'll move on. All right, so this is an example of dense irregular connective tissue. All right, dense irregular connective tissue. The pink fibers are collagen fibers, and you see that these are arranged in a very irregular pattern. Some are kind of running side to side horizontally, some are running vertically, some are kind of running at an angle. Okay, so you'd find this underneath the skin and the dermis. You'd find this surrounding joint capsules as well. All right, so that it provides resistance to stretch and pull in multiple directions, right? All right, so take a look at this one and pause the video, try to answer it. I'll move on. This is adipose tissue, right? So adipose tissue is a type of loose connective tissue. You see the large fat vacuole where the lipid droplet would be. You see the thin plasma membrane, and then you see the dark nucleus that is pushed off to the side. Remember, we said we have fat that can serve as energy storage, serve as insulation, serve as cushioning as well. Okay, the cell type here is adipocytes. All right, so take a look at this one. This is dense regular connective tissue, right? You know this is dense regular because you see the collagen fibers all oriented in the same plane, and then you see the dark purple staining nuclei of the fibroblast kind of pushed in between. All right. Now this will look similar to one of the muscle types we'll look at later called smooth muscle tissue, but we'll talk about how to differentiate smooth muscle tissue from dense regular connective tissue. All right, take a look at this one. This is an example of bone, right, or osseous connective tissue, all right? So you see this is usually a very, very unique tissue. Usually it's pretty easy to identify. So you see those large rings, right, those large osteons. You see those smaller concentric rings called lamellae. You see the dark black spaces, which are the lacunae, and then the cell within the lacunae is called the osteocyte. Okay, this large central region that you see here, you see it here, that central region there, and there. This is called the central canal. Sometimes it's called the Haversian canal, and we'll look at that in more detail when we do our skeletal lecture. All right, take a look at this one. This is an example of hyaline cartilage, right? So you'll learn to identify cartilage. Cartilage also has a very unique shape. This is very characteristic of cartilage, and specifically hyaline cartilage. So it has lots of lacunae, relatively small with their chondrocytes, scattered throughout, and then the ground substance looks very glassy. It looks very clear. You can't make out individual collagen fibers, and so this is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage makes up our embryonic skeleton. It makes up our costal cartilage, makes up the tip of our nose. We have it on the ends of our long bones as well, okay? All right, take a look at this one. Hopefully you recognize this one. This should be easy. This is blood, right? So this is blood connective tissue with our red blood cells or erythrocytes, white blood cells or leukocytes, and then platelets or thrombocytes, okay? All right, so we will stop here, and we will pick up with the next part, part 5, I believe, talking about muscle tissue.